Need fast, reliable resources for emergency services? Get free policies, procedures, and other tools at ResponderHelp.com, your one-stop resource hub.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Risk Control and Education. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses some potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rodgers, and today we're discussing managing the cost of risk in your organization. Joining me on the program today is Scott Harkins, and Scott is the Senior Vice President of Risk Control and Education for the Glatfelter Insurance Group. Scott is joining us today to discuss some things to consider to help your organization control your cost of risk. Scott, I want to thank you for joining me today, and I really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Chris. Love being here.
Good to hear. Good to hear. So I think we all know that insurance rates and premiums are at an all-time high, across the country. What can our clients do to control the cost of risk, and what do we mean when we talk about the cost of risk?
Well, Chris, let's start talking about risk. Risk can lead to a positive or a negative outcome. I do have a tendency sometimes to frequent casinos, and if I go in and put $10 down on red or black, there's a chance that I can win. There's a better chance that I'm going to lose. So in the insurance world, we typically look at the cost of risk as being a loss, or at best, no loss, at least on an individual client basis. When we're talking about the cost of risk, we're talking about direct costs and indirect costs. Direct costs include things like the cost of your insurance program, what you're paying in premiums, any retained losses or deductibles that you might have, and maybe even costs that your department operations are involved in acquiring that insurance or handling claims, etc. We also have indirect costs, which are harder to put a price on per se, but things like loss of productivity or morale, remedial training costs, or the need to train somebody to fill a position because somebody got hurt. There could be a negative press, which gives you a negative light in your community, which can lead to a loss of goodwill and public image. So all of those things are indirect costs. But the cost of risk, things like a loss of a firefighter, a crash in a rig, are the things that have led to changes in our industry. Those changes have been slow. Many people say it's 200 years of tradition unimpeded by progress. That's not exactly true, because I think the pace of change has certainly accelerated in the last couple of decades.
And the cost of risk has certainly accelerated in the past decade for everything evolved in emergency services. So how do we manage risk and the inherent costs associated with it?
Yeah, Chris, you're exactly right. The costs, if we just look at the commercial auto industry as a whole, the cost of repairs, the length of time it takes to get a new truck, all of those things have driven insurance claim costs through the roof. It might help to talk a little bit about how insurance actually works. Insurance companies try to charge enough money in premium to cover losses and expenses and still make a profit. For argument's sake, let's say that a carrier needs to have a 50% loss ratio to be profitable. The loss ratio is the dollars paid out in claims divided by the dollars earned through insurance premiums. In short, that means the more claim dollars that are paid out, the more premium dollars the carrier needs to charge to make a profit. Conversely, the fewer claim dollars paid out, the less a carrier needs to charge to remain profitable.
So does that mean, if other organizations are having significant losses and my organization might not be having losses, that still could impact how much I might charge, because we're all part of the same essentially pool of going in of paying for these losses?
In essence, yes, it does, Chris, because the industry is somewhat looked at as a whole. Insurance uses the law of large numbers. If we insure enough fire departments or ambulance corps or 911 centers, and we're spreading those losses out over all of those, in aggregate, what we're looking to be is at that 50% loss ratio. Any individual account could be at a 200% loss ratio, or more hopefully a 0% loss ratio in any given year. The hard part, or the part that you can't figure out, is who's going to be the 200% this year and who's going to be the 0. So it looks at the large numbers. We can be fairly certain as to where we will be at the end of any given year, with the caveat that changes that happen during those years, disruptions to supply chains, catastrophic events, and those types of things can impact that, so that we may be playing catch up from an insurance standpoint going forward. I think from an insurance perspective, we would prefer to be able to charge less and still maintain our profit margins. That's where we would like to be. And I don't have to tell your listeners that new apparatus costs are soaring and that they're waiting 3 to 4 years to get a new piece delivered. Those are the types of things that are just driving those costs through the roof. And the entire commercial auto insurance results are dragging the entire industry, the insurance industry's results down. So it's very difficult. From an insurance carrier's results are probably not top of mind for any of your listeners. But I have to tell you, I urge your listeners to take note, because those results may certainly have an impact on any individual's organization or ability to even find insurance going forward if we can't improve those results.
Especially it's something that you can't really, as an organization right now, plan for, because there's the rates or what you're paying for insurance is so volatile. So the best way that you can kind of have some sort of semblance of what we might be paying is controlling your risk by reducing the amount of accidents that that are happening in your organization. That's about the best way that you can tell this is probably in the area of what I'm going to be paying for insurance, because it is so volatile right now.
Yeah, it is volatile. I certainly give you that as not something that we see changing anytime in the near future either. But the one thing or caveat that I would put in there is those accounts that are doing the best job of managing their cost of risk and handling those issues to reduce the number of crashes or claims that they have are the ones that are getting the better pricing. So it may be more than what your expectations were, but it's still going to be less than the rest of the industry, because there, again, the law of large numbers. We're trying to get the most money from those accounts that are not doing well from a loss perspective.
Well, Scott, you mentioned pricing, and insurance has a price to it, and we're talking about controlling those costs. Insurance is a risk transfer mechanism. So can you talk about how risk transfer through insurance can help an emergency service organization manage their insurance costs?
Yeah, I can, Chris, but maybe let me just back up a little bit and talk to the listeners about how to manage their risk. And risk management itself is a process. To manage risk, you need to first identify the risk, then you need to analyze it or evaluate what that risk is and the impact that it can have on your organization, then determine ways to treat it, like using insurance for transfer being one of those. And then you need to continually monitor that process, because it changes. The things that you put in place, did they work? If not, okay, what do we need to tweak or make better? So it's certainly something that every emergency service organization is doing today, whether they know it or not. They may not have a formal process in place, but let me try to explain it by using an example of a house fire. The first thing you do at a house fire is you're going to identify what the risks are. In emergency services, we're calling that a walk around. We're doing a 360 to try and identify what the risks are. If we don't identify the risks, we can't manage it. Gordon Graham of Lexipol fame is famous for saying predictable is preventable, and he's absolutely right. If we can predict what's going to happen, we should be able to prevent it. And that's exactly what a scene size-up is intended to do. That second step of analyzing and evaluating the risk, you need to ask yourself questions like, how likely is it that the risk will result in a negative outcome? And if it does, how severe would the consequences be? With our house fire example, how far is the fire extended during our 360 walk-around? How likely is a structural failure or collapse? Is there a life hazard within the structure? Those are all things that we're using to analyze the risk and basically doing a cost-benefit analysis as to how we're going to treat that risk. There's 4 ways to treat risk. We can avoid it, we can reduce it, we can manage it, or we can transfer it. Avoidance is obviously preferred all the time, but can't always be part of the equation. We know we're going to house fire, we're going to a house fire, but I could avoid the risk of a structural collapse just by setting up water monitors or master streams across the street. I'm not going to lose anybody in a collapse then. Might not be the most effective way to fight that fire, but I certainly could avoid the collapse exposure. I could reduce that collapse exposure by using an aggressive exterior attack rather than an interior attack. I could manage that risk, and that most likely started long before we got called to that structure fire. Before we were dispatched, we spent hours and hours training on how to fight that fire, or different fires of that type, and the options we have depending on the life hazard, the fire involvement, and the resources available. I can transfer that risk. Insurance is probably the most common way that emergency service organizations transfer the cost of their risk. And they likely have an insurance policy in place to cover the cost of any lost or damaged equipment that they might have while fighting that fire or during a structural collapse.
Well, I appreciate you going back and kind of filling in some of those holes there. I jumped up, I jumped a little bit ahead in the process. But can you now talk about how risk transfer using insurance can help an ESO manager insurance costs?
Yeah, absolutely I can. One of the biggest factors in anybody's insurance premiums are the pricing that they receive. The simple answer, if you would like to reduce your insurance costs, reduce your number of claims. And the amount of dollars that are paid out as a result of those claims. That's a major contributing factor to the premium that any emergency service organization is charged. But I don't necessarily think the premiums should be the concern. They're a byproduct of how well the emergency service organization is actually managing their risk. It's a direct reflection of how well they do that. So let me give you a real life example, and I'll try to stay off of a soapbox here, but there was a young mother of 3 on her way to pick up her 3-year-old daughter at a daycare. Her vehicle was T-boned by an emergency vehicle at an intersection and was knocked into a nearby construction vehicle. She was pronounced dead at the scene. My question to all your listeners is, what makes her life less important than the person that we were quote-unquote rushing to rescue? I think first and foremost, every emergency service organization needs to go by the motto, do no harm. Your organization should have emergency vehicle response guidelines in place that are not only developed, but are implemented and enforced. Your chiefs and your officers need to be following them and enforcing them. Example, they need to walk the talk. They can't just talk the talk, because firefighters are smart enough to realize that what the chiefs are actually doing is what they mean, not necessarily what they say. So those things need to be the same.
And they need to be a living document, because they don't just write them and put them on the shelf and not train to them, because we need to follow whatever we have in place. We need to follow, because if we're not, whatever we're doing in the field, if it's in conflict with that, it's not going to look good for us. 1, because we're not following our written procedures, and 2, what we might be doing in the field, if it's more quote unquote hazardous, that might be what the standard that we're held to.
You're absolutely spot on, Chris. It just needs to be done every time the vehicle wheels start moving. It needs to be reinforced. The driver needs to know and understand it and follow it. The officer or whoever's in that officer's seat assuming that position needs to remind the driver, if they're not following those, that they need to follow those. It needs to be a continuous process to make sure that everybody's doing that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your story there.
But, well, that story usually gets me up on a soapbox, and I can go on for about hours as to why some of the things that we do in emergency services make absolutely no sense. We respond to, out of every 100 calls we respond to, 95 of those are probably not really an emergency when everything is said and done. But we respond to almost every call just like it is, quote unquote, the big one, or it's a baby choking. They're not all that. I think you need to have a candid conversation in your organization to talk about how you respond to calls. It should be no secret to anybody that responding in an emergency mode is much more susceptible to being involved in a crash than if you're responding following normal traffic laws. If you don't see that, it should be common fact that it is much more dangerous, because there's a lot more chances of things going on for other drivers trying to react to your actions when they're not familiar with the way you drive. So think about things like modifying your responses. I use an example all the time. Where I grew up, our school bus garage alarm would go off in the middle of every thunderstorm. No doubt it was going to go off. And we would respond to it like the bus garage was on fire. After the 50th time that it wasn't on fire, shouldn't we really be responding like it's not going to be on fire and upgrade that response if it actually is? It's still there, so it still hasn't burned.
So you mentioned modified response. That's a topic that's kind of it's newer in the industry because, as you said, a lot of times it was just the way things were done. The tone goes out and we're running hot. So can you kind of just go into a little bit about what we mean by modified response?
Sure, I can. But, Chris, I'm old. Your listeners should probably know that I'm old, but modified response is really not that new. Emergency medical dispatch has been around for decades. And that's basically a modified response.
I guess the phrase is new.
Yeah, no disagreement. And in the fire circles, it's much more or much less prevalent. But there's an EFD program too to do the same thing that EMD does for emergency medical dispatch as for fire. Just asking certain questions, you can start to understand the depth of the emergency, quote unquote, that you're responding to. And dispatchers, as that first line of defense or of action, are in a position to determine if that's really a serious event. I would put to any fire chief that's out there that if you're responding in emergency mode to a carbon monoxide alarm when there is nobody showing symptoms and nobody in the building, you're doing a disservice to your community. And I really wouldn't want to have to be you if something bad should happen and you're talking to the press and trying to explain why your vehicle was traveling at an excessive rate of speed and it was involved in an accident going to that call.
Yeah, the optics aren't going to look good if it's a very minor case that you just turn, or minor situation that our actions just turned into a major situation.
Yeah, whether you're a volunteer or you're being paid for your services, everybody in emergency services needs to be a professional. And professionals do things a certain way. So it's important to know what a professional does and act like a professional. And acting like a professional includes responding appropriately to the call that's at hand, be it an emergency or non-emergency. And let's not treat everything as an emergency if we have enough information to let us know that it's not. I'll give you another example. I know of departments that will run everything hot to an automatic alarm. So I've got 5 engines responding from all over town to go to an automatic alarm that everybody that's responding is pretty sure is nothing. Well, I would put to you, okay, even if you want to say it's an emergency call, it was received an emergency call, you may be granted some immunities by your state law, I would still say to you, well, maybe you run the first engine hot and everything else in a normal traffic flow, non-emergent, and upgrade them if you get there and it's the big one.
And the best thing to do is not to test that to see how it might get litigated or however it might get handled by not having that accident.
Yeah, absolutely. Not having a crash is the easiest way to handle the press.
Absolutely. So, Scott, one final question. Can you kind of tie this all up for the listener?
I can, Chris. In essence, you, the listener, or your organization are the only ones really out there that can control your cost of risk. I work for an insurance carrier. Insurance companies can charge more, and they're trying to charge as much as they need to charge to be able to still make a profit. But you can make it easier on your insurance carrier or make it easier for them to provide you with preferred pricing if you're not having crashes and can eliminate those and are managing your cost of risk. And it's not just autos, it's other lines of business too. Are you doing the right things from the human resources standpoint, hiring, firing, wrongful terminations, et cetera, et cetera? Your insurance premiums are a direct reflection of how well you manage the risk that you face. I urge you to formalize that process for managing risk and minimizing the risks that you face, not only because it can help reduce the monetary costs, but more importantly, it'll help you reduce the risk to your responders and the community you serve.
Well, Scott, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. It's always a joy to talk to you, and I really appreciate your time explaining this concept and how our listeners and some of our insureds can hopefully control that cost of risk. So thanks for joining us today.
Always my pleasure, Chris.
And I want to thank you for listening to the program and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guest, Scott Harkins, once again for his time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by emailing VFISriskcontrol@VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Glatfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees.